Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Love That's Worth the Risk by Laura Landon, narrated by Susan Duerden. Prologue. Annalise Washburn stood on the top of the cliff and stared down at the swirling sea below her. The full moon cast ripples of light on the dark water, almost like an invitation. She pulled down the hood of her green velvet cloak to let the cool breeze caress her flushed face. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her throat felt tight and raw. She just wanted this nightmare to end. As she reached up one hand to brush back a blonde curl, the moonlight reflected on her gold wedding ring. "Jack," she whispered, tears blinding her as she whirled around, ready to run home to him. But she knew there was nowhere to run. Her husband couldn't save her. Taking a deep breath, Annalise reminded herself that she was out of options. There was only one way to end this nightmare. Ruthlessly wiping away her tears, she moved toward the small stone bench where Jack had proposed to her. She took off her cloak first, neatly placing it on top of the bench. Then she removed the combs and pins from her hair until the long golden tresses hung loose around her narrow shoulders. Annalise closed her eyes for a moment, then twisted the wedding ring off her finger and gently laid it in the velvet folds of her cloak. The wind suddenly picked up, blowing her hair wildly around her and biting through the thin fabric of the simple grey gown she wore. It dried the tears on her face as she cast one last look in the direction of the home she shared with Jack. Annalise could just barely make out the large stone structure in the distance. It all seemed so far away. "Forgive me," she whispered. Then she walked to the edge of the cliff. Chapter 1. Major Jack Washburn entered the Angel's Wings jam and jelly shop and walked to where Mrs. Mildred Parker, the manager, stood behind the counter arranging a new display. "Good morning, gorgeous," Jack greeted her, giving the middle-aged manager a heart-stopping smile. "Good morning, Major," she answered, matching his smile. "I heard that, Major," Millie's husband said from the back room. "I'll warn you to stop flirting with my wife," he teased. "You leave the Major alone, Anthony. At least he knows how to make a lady feel noticed." "Are you saying that I don't?" Tony Parker asked as he emerged from the back room. Millie rounded the corner and walked toward her husband. "You forgot all the pretty words you ever knew after I gave you our firstborn." "Oh, sweeting," Tony said, coming in close to his wife. "You behave yourself, Tony." She wagged a finger at him. "We got young lasses working in the store. Miss Livy will give you a piece of her mind if she hears what you say in front of these young ears." "I didn't say anything, did I, lasses?" he said, turning toward the three young shopgirls who stood together near the store window. "It was the Major who started this conversation." "Me?" Jack said, feigning innocence. "I would never start something so inappropriate." The three girls from the orphanage that Livy had brought in to work in the shop giggled behind their hands. He winked at them just to see them blush. "You girls look lively," Millie scolded. "Jenny, unlock the door and put the open sign in the window. It's time to start the day." Jenny did as she was told, and soon after the door opened, their first customers entered the shop. Jack stepped into the back room and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Millie kept on the cast-iron range top. His head hurt like bloody hell again this morning. "Another late night, Major," Millie said, following him into the back room. "When are you going to start taking better care of yourself?" "I take perfect care of myself, Millie. I spread my happiness and pleasing personality around to every pretty female I meet, and even some who are not so pretty." Jack took a gulp of his coffee that burned his tongue, then gave Millie's cheek a pinch. "Stop that, you flirt," she reprimanded him, but he saw the smile on her face. "Don't you think it's time you quit your wild carousing, found yourself a wife and settled down?" "Didn't you know, Millie? I've already tried that, and it cured me from ever trying it again." He took another swallow of his coffee, then refilled his cup. When it was full, he ventured a gaze into Millie's face and saw her look of shock and sadness and pity. You were married, she gasped. Oh, Major, what happened? Bloody hell, what had made him say that? Only his two closest friends and fellow soldiers knew about his disastrous marriage, and he intended to keep it that way. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to find out that Annalise had chosen death over spending her life with him. Jack envisioned his wife Annalise, and how deeply they'd loved each other, how desperately in love they'd been. She'd been the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, with a laugh that brightened a room and a smile that outshone the sun. He'd never discovered what happened that had forced her to take her life while he was away on an assignment for the Crown. But something tragic must have taken place for someone as vibrant and full of life as his Annie to step off that cliff and into the sea. If only he'd recovered her body, then he could have buried her properly. But she had never been found. Jack had to be content knowing she was no doubt buried at the bottom of the sea. He closed his eyes and heard Millie behind him. Are you sure you don't want to talk about it, Major? No, Millie. It's not a story I relish repeating. She studied his face. Something tells me it's a story you need to repeat to someone. A man can only drown his troubles for so long before they start to eat him up inside. Well, Millie, don't worry. If I ever need to get my sorry past out in the open, you'll be the first person I come to. She shook her head, chuckling. Oh, like I believe that will ever happen. Major, Tony approached him, holding up a folded piece of paper. This just came for you. Jack swallowed the last of his coffee, then gave Millie a light kiss on the cheek. Got to go, Millie, he said, taking the note from Tony. I've been saved by the call of duty. Yes, Major, you go on, she said wryly. Someone has to save us innocent citizens from all those villains out there. That's my sworn duty, Jack bantered. I feel safer just knowing you're out there protecting us, she said, then cackled again. Jack gave her a royal salute, then left the jelly shop and walked toward Commander Waterford's office. Maybe there would be an assignment for Jack, and he'd be gone long enough that Millie would forget what he'd told her. But he doubted it. She was like a dog with a bone. Once she latched on to something, she refused to let it go. And his reference to his marriage was too tasty a bone to let go of. He was afraid Millie would always remember where that bone was buried. He walked the several blocks to the command post and stepped inside. The commander is waiting for you, Major, a young man in full uniform told him. You can go right in. Are you new, Corporal? Jack said to the young recruit sitting behind the desk. Yes, sir, the corporal said, getting to his feet and greeting Jack with a salute. Corporal Newquist, sir. Well, Corporal, it's good to meet you. Yes, sir, Major. Commander Waterford is waiting for you. Thank you, Corporal. Jack knocked twice on Commander Waterford's door and walked in. Good morning, sir. Waterford lifted his gaze. Good morning, Washburn. You look like hell. Rough night. Jack straightened his clothes and ran his fingers through his hair. Yes, sir. It was a short night. Did you need to see me? Yes, take a seat. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in the chair before the commander's desk. We have a matter that's come to our attention that I'd like you to look into. A matter? Yes, smuggling. Illegal contraband. Could you be more specific, sir? Opium. Jack took a swallow of his coffee and winced. It wasn't nearly as good as the coffee Millie made. It was much stronger, and that was what Jack needed this morning. What do you know about this smuggling ring? Not enough, I'm sorry to say. Waterford sighed. They're working out of Whitstable, all over Kent. The leader of the gang has kept himself hidden so far. All we know about the gang members is that they are well organised and professional. They've already killed 2 of our finest agents, and their deaths weren't quick or humane. He sucked in a deep breath. Their mutilated bodies were returned to us as a message to leave the smugglers alone, or the same would happen to the next agent we sent. I see, Jack said, before finishing his coffee in 2 quick gulps. I don't expect you to handle this alone, Major. How many agents do you want to go with you? None. I'll go alone. The commander frowned.
That's a bad idea, Major. You'd be wise to take some backup with you.
Jack shook his head. Several strangers arriving in Whitstable at the same time will draw undue attention. Let me go in alone. If I think I need help, I'll send word. Commander Waterford stared at Jack for a long moment, then sighed.
Very well.
He reached for a thin folder.
This is all the information we have. I hope there's something in there that helps you.
Jack rose to take the folder, briefly skimming the contents as he moved toward the door.
One more thing, Washburn.
Jack turned at the door, staring at his commander's solemn expression.
Yes. I may not be here when you return. I'm going to be at my daughter's in Lancaster. She just had a baby and wants me to come for the christening, then stay for a while.
How long do you plan to be gone?
Not sure. A month or more. Depends on how bored I get.
Who are they sending to take your place?
Commander Roger Levinson. Have you met him?
Jack nodded. We've met. Can't say we're friends.
I'm not sure Levinson has friends.
I can understand why, Jack said. He's not an easy man to like.
Trust no one,
Waterford warned him as Jack walked out the door.
And try to come back alive.
Jack saluted his commanding officer and left the office. He was glad he'd been sent on an assignment. If everything went as planned, Waterford would be back before Jack was. Then he and Levinson wouldn't even have to see each other. Jack tried to consider what he felt about the assignment. 2 agents had already died, and it was possible that he might too. He should be terrified, or at least hesitant to go on such a dangerous assignment. But he wasn't. The last several months had put a few things into perspective. Quinn and Theo, his 2 best friends and fellow soldiers, were both settled in their lives. They were happy being married and raising children. That wasn't a possibility for Jack. He'd already found the love of his life and had lost her. He didn't want to search for another perfect woman. How could anyone compare to Annalise? She'd been as perfect as any woman could be, the only woman he would ever love. But now she was dead. He'd go on this assignment. If he came back alive, that would be the way it was supposed to be. If he didn't, that was also the way it was supposed to be. It didn't matter to him either way. If he survived, there would always be another mission, and another, until he went on a mission from which he didn't return. Jack entered the boarding house where he kept a room. He couldn't call it the boarding house where he lived, because he didn't actually live there. His small flat on the 3rd floor was only the room where he stored his clothes, and slept when he didn't have anywhere else to sleep, when he wasn't sprawled in some pretty female's scented bed. This room in the boarding house was only the place he slept when he wanted to be alone, which wasn't often. Too many memories haunted his thoughts when he was alone, thoughts and memories he didn't want to relive. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and opened the door. There was no sense in calling this his home, because he didn't have a home. He hadn't had a home since Annalise killed herself. Several letters lay scattered on the floor, and he picked them up and sifted through them. There were a few bills that he'd have to take care of before he left, but nothing important. He was about to start packing when there was a knock at the door. Jack opened the door and had to lower his gaze to see the small, dirty lad in front of him.
"Here,"
the lad said, holding out a missive. The boy was ready to run as soon as Jack took the letter. Instead of taking the letter, Jack grabbed the child's filthy collar and pulled him into the room.
"Let me go, you blighter!"
the lad yelled. He struggled to get free, but Jack didn't release him. He grabbed the letter and looked at it. There was nothing written on the outside of the hastily folded note.
"Who sent this?"
he asked, still holding the youngster.
"I dunno,"
the boy answered.
"I was just told to give it to you."
Was it a man or a lady?
"Wasn't no lady, but it was a she."
Young or old?
"Young."
Very well, Jack said, then reached in his pocket and took out a coin. The boy grabbed the coin and took off at a run. Jack let him go. He doubted the boy knew any more. He stepped inside his room and closed the door behind him, then tore the missive open and scanned the writing. It was a woman's hand, but not an educated woman's writing. This person's penmanship was hardly legible. He looked at the bottom of the letter, but there was no signature. Evidently, whoever wrote the letter didn't want to be recognised. Jack poured some whiskey into his glass and carried it along with the note to the only chair in his flat and sat. He took a swallow and started to read the words in front of him. It was difficult to make out all the words. The person's spelling was atrocious, and her sentences scarcely made sense. Thank heaven it wasn't long, only 4 lines. Major, your wife needs you. Please come fast afore they kill her. She's not dead like you think. She's in the building behind the church in Whitstable. Hurry. The paper dropped from his hand, and Jack watched it flutter to the floor. Although there was hardly a word that was spelled correctly, the meaning was clear. Annalise wasn't dead like he'd thought for the past 2 years. She hadn't killed herself or drowned like everyone wanted him to believe. Without moving, Jack stared at the paper on the floor as if the words would change and his heart could start beating again. Then slowly, carefully, as if the paper was a priceless manuscript, he picked it up and read it again. Annie was alive. The love of his life wasn't dead. So what had happened to her? Jack's temper rose. Why had she let him believe she was dead when she wasn't? What joke was she playing on him, and why? What had made her put him through the hell he'd suffered over the last 2 years? His blood roared in his head. His shock and disbelief turned to anger, then fury. How could she have done something so cruel? She'd told him she loved him. People who loved each other didn't force them to go through hell. Jack considered what he was going to do. Go after her, or let her stay where she'd chosen to be. He let the words in the missive echo again in his head. Your wife needs you. Please come fast afore they kill her. He threw more liquor to the back of his throat. Your wife needs you. Please come fast afore they kill her. Jack finished packing and stuffed the folder Waterford had given him in among his clothes. He went for his horse that he had stabled behind the boarding house and left. He stopped at the Angel's Wings Jams and Jellies and told Millie that he didn't know when he'd be back. He left instructions that if she needed anything, she should contact Theo, then left for Whitstable. His brain had become a seething mess. Was he to believe that Annie wasn't dead, that she was still alive, and worse, that someone was trying to kill her? He shook off his doubt. He had to operate as if it were all true, that she was being kept in the building behind the church in Whitstable. If he ignored it and was wrong, he'd never forgive himself. Jack pushed Comet as fast as he dared and reached Whitstable in less than 2 hours instead of the usual 3. The first thing he did was find the church, then go to the building behind it. Jack stared at the run-down stone structure and the broken sign that read Whitstable Hospital. Several windows were cracked or were missing glass panes. 3 stairs led to a worn grey porch where a half-dozen wooden chairs sat. An inside door to the building stood open, no doubt to allow a breeze to move the air inside, and the screen on the front sagged on its hinges. The lawn in the front was choked with weeds, and 2 flower beds stood void of flowers. Jack lifted his foot onto the first unsteady step. He hoped it would hold him. After he climbed all 3, he walked to the open door and stepped across the threshold. The interior of the hospital was no more inviting than the outside. In fact, it was considerably less hospitable. If Annie had ever lived here, Jack didn't doubt that she was already dead. Chapter 2. Jack stood in the foyer of the hospital and allowed his eyes to adjust to the darkness. There were no candles lit, nor were there any lamps aglow. Even the curtains at the windows had been closed and the draperies pulled. It was as if someone didn't want anyone to see inside the hospital. "Hello?" Jack called out, but no one answered. He called out again, then turned around, waiting for someone to answer his call. It took a bit, but eventually he saw a man in a dark suit walking toward him. "Welcome to Whitstable," the man said as a greeting. The doctor wasn't at all what Jack expected. He was middle-aged and well-built, but not very handsome. He appeared very muscular, more resembling a bodyguard or a man hired to guard the door to gambling hell than a man hired for his compassion or his medical training.
"Hello, Doctor. My name is Jack."
Jack stopped. He thought it might be wiser to use a false name.
"My name is Jack Lucas, but everyone calls me Jack." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Jack. I'm Dr. Wintermere."
Jack smiled and extended his hand.
"It's a pleasure to meet you. What brings you to Whitstable, Jack?"
"Nothing in particular. I'm just newly out of the service and have decided to spend several weeks travelling and getting reacquainted with the area before I'm forced to settle down and help my father run his business."
"And what business would that be?"
"He's a shopkeeper. He owns a jam and jelly shop in London."
"Oh, that sounds interesting."
"It is," Jack said, "but quite a bit more sedate than the life I was used to in the army."
"I can imagine."
"Would you mind if I looked around your hospital?"
"Not at all, Jack. Let me show you. I insist."
"I'm sure I can manage on my own," Jack said.
"Please, I don't mind. Here, follow me."
Jack tried not to let his disappointment show. He would much rather have investigated on his own. He doubted Dr. Wintermere would take him where he was most interested in going.
"If you'll follow me,"
the doctor said, then led him down a long hallway, past one closed-off room after another. When they reached the end of the hall, they stopped. "Do you mind if I look into some of the rooms?" Jack asked. The doctor shook his head.
"I'm afraid that's not permitted. We don't like disturbing our patients once we get them settled for the afternoon. I'm sure you understand how fragile many of them are."
"Yes, of course. What ailments do most of your patients suffer from?"
"Most of them suffer from mental deficiencies. Not all, of course, but many of them. Some of them have simply lost their memories and don't recognize their loved ones any longer. And some of them simply wander off and get lost. Their families can no longer keep them safe, so they entrust them to our care."
"I see." Dr. Wintermere explained the history of the hospital, the special features of the rooms, and the number of staff members to care for the patients. When he finished, he led Jack back to the waiting room. That's when Jack heard it. The sound wasn't very loud, nor was it distinct enough that he could understand the muffled words being said, but it was definitely a sound made by a human, a high, keening cry of pain or torture. "Did you hear that?" Jack asked.
"No, I didn't hear anything,"
the doctor said, attempting to lead him toward the door.
"Nothing other than the creaks and heavy shifting of a crumbling old building."
"What does that door lead to?" The doctor turned to where Jack pointed.
"The cellar. But nothing is down there but spare beds and furniture and a few odds and ends. Nothing worth investigating."
Jack stopped to listen again. "Then I guess I couldn't have heard anything," he said, then turned to the exit. "Well, I've taken up enough of your time, Dr. Wintermere. Thank you so much for the tour."
"Thank you for your interest in our hospital. We're very proud of the work we do here."
Jack shot him a look. The doctoring would have to be a far sight better than the building maintenance if there were anything to be proud of.
"If you ever want another tour, come back. You're always welcome."
"Thank you," Jack said, and walked toward the exit. Although, why anyone would want to return for another tour of empty hallways and rooms that were closed off to visitors, he had no idea.
"It was my pleasure,"
Dr. Wintermere said as Jack left the building. There was something strange about the hospital, something strange about the noises he'd heard coming from what was described as the cellar, something strange about Wintermere and how intent he was on steering Jack away from the cellar. Jack mounted Comet and rode down the street until he was out of sight. He didn't want Wintermere to think he was overly curious about what went on at the hospital, even though he was. He'd have to come back later, after everyone was asleep for the night, and he wouldn't run into anyone who might see him. The first thing Jack was going to do was go to the boarding house he'd seen when he rode into town and get a room. He wasn't about to walk the streets until dark. That would only draw unwanted attention. He'd draw enough of that tomorrow or the next day when the residents of Whitstable would see him out and about. Tonight he would do as much investigating as he could without anyone knowing. Tomorrow he'd make himself known, so the female who wrote the letter on Annie's behalf would know he'd come for her. Jack got a room at a local lodging house and paid for 2 weeks. He hoped it wouldn't take him that long to find Annie, but he reminded himself that he'd been sent here on a mission. He was to uncover the ring of smugglers who were bringing in opium. That would no doubt take longer, and he didn't want the landlady to throw his clothes out onto the street if he happened to be gone more than a week. He put the clothes he'd brought with him in a drawer and slid the bag under the bed. Then he took out his pistol and made sure it was loaded and ready to fire. He placed it on the bedside table within reach of the bed. He didn't know why he expected trouble, but he did. Perhaps it was because 2 agents had already lost their lives trying to uncover who was in charge of the smuggling ring. But most likely it was Commander Waterford's warning to watch his back that alerted him to the danger involved in this mission. He would have to be on his guard if he wanted to make it out of Whitstable alive. Jack sat on the edge of the bed and took out the message again. "Your wife needs you. Please come fast before they kill her. She's not dead like you think. She's in the building behind the church in Whitstable. Hurry." Even though he had it memorized, he read it again. "She's not dead. She's not dead." When he first received word 2 years ago that Annie had taken her life, he didn't believe it. They were too much in love. Jack was happier being married to Annie than he'd ever been in his life, and he was convinced that she was happy too. So why had she jumped to her death? That's what he'd been told. That was what Annie's stepmother had written him. She'd explained that Annie had been so miserable that she didn't want to live any longer, that because of his work as an agent for the government, she couldn't stand being left alone for such long periods of time, that Annie must have inherited her mother's mental sickness. Over time, she became so despondent and depressed that nothing they did for her helped her want to live. In the end, she took her own life. Jack hadn't believed that lie at first. For 2 years he searched for her, but she wasn't to be found. Finally, he had to admit that what Annie's stepmother had written him was true, that his wife had been so miserable with him that she couldn't stand to live the life they'd forged together. Jack rose from the bed and paced his room. He stopped on each pass past the window and looked out. The streets were quiet, and there wasn't anything to see, but it was still too light to leave without drawing attention to himself. He couldn't go out until it was dark enough that no one would see him. He paced the room several more times and tried to remember what Annie had looked like the last time he saw her. He could still see her golden hair and her blue eyes. He could still see her heart-shaped face and her ready smile. And if he allowed the memories to escape from where they were buried, he could still remember what it was like to have her in his arms and hold her next to him, what it felt like to make love to her. Jack sat in a cushioned chair and tipped his head back to rest it on the back of the soft chair. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift to his assignment. What were the odds that the assignment he was sent on happened to be in Whitstable, Kent? And that was the same place where the message he'd received told him he'd find Annie. What were the odds that he'd received the letter telling him that Annie was still alive, the same day Waterford had sent him on a mission? And what did Waterford mean when he told him to watch his back and try to come back alive? Jack considered the questions he didn't have answers to and listened until there wasn't any traffic going past. When it was dark enough outside that he wouldn't be seen, he left his room. Whitstable was a quiet little town, barely larger than a village. Most of the men in the town worked the oyster beds, as their fathers and grandfathers had done before them, so their day began at dawn and ended at sundown. Jack hoped that meant no one would be out at this hour. He made his way back to the hospital by a little used path, and on foot, not wanting to draw attention saddling Comet. When he reached the hospital, he walked around the building to make sure the staff wasn't still about. Everything was dark. The only sound he heard was the pounding of his heart. He couldn't believe it was possible he might see Annie again. Couldn't believe that in 2 years she hadn't been able to make her way to him, or that she hadn't wanted to. Fingers of dread wrapped around his heart and squeezed it unmercifully. The message had said she was in danger. Who would want to hurt her? Who would want her dead? He kept close to the building as he made his way around the hospital. Finally, he...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?